The wheel gap on a stock suspension GR86 is pretty atrocious. I understand it's for suspension travel and all, but a 3-finger gap is unnecessary. For comparison, the stock CR suspension on the S2000 is a 2-finger gap, and even I get criticisms for it. With this much suspension travel on a GR86, you might as well go rock crawling. Luckily, we have a few solutions to the issue.
One option is to use these cast iron Mopar heads to weigh the stock springs down and get the height you desire. You can use any heads you want, but remember Chrysler always works better than Ford or GM. It'll take a while, but if you have 2 heads, it'll be half the time. 5 years instead of 10. Make sure to use automotive grade cardboard so it doesn't scratch the car.
Coilovers are another alternative, but the best ones get very expensive. I like to keep things simple and chose a different route.
A better solution are these Grow Motorsports lowering springs. Collaborated with and manufactured by HAL springs. These are made in Japan.
One of the biggest factors for me choosing these particular set of springs is that it's a linear constant rate design. Every other brand of lowering spring for the GR86 is progressive variable rate. The stock OEM springs are linear as well, and these Grow springs should be similar but just at a lower height. The advertised drop is about 30 millimeters or a little over 1 1/8 of an inch. I'll measure everything and verify the results. These Grow springs are very nice pieces. They come powder coated in a beautiful silver with tons of metal flake, and they're completely mesmerizing. They match perfectly with a silver car. I'm no expert on these springs, but I did see that one episode of Best Motoring. These Grow springs are clearly marked GR86 front and rear, and should be impossible for you to mix them up. I was disappointed at first that the springs I received had some shipping damage, but I built a bridge and got over it. Once installed, you would never see the chip powder coat, but still an area that HAL springs can improve upon for future customers, as these springs are absolutely gorgeous in person. They're almost too pretty to install. First order of business is getting measurements of the stock ride height, 26.5 inches to the wheel arc. I even used my fancy laser measuring tool. I placed the beam on the lowest underbody corner right behind the wheel, 6 1/16 of an inch. Now time to measure the rears. Tape measure to the wheel arc indicates about 26 5/8. Again, I measured the lowest underbody corner right in front of the wheel. For the rears, the height there is about 6 5/8 of an inch. The nice thing about a lift is when the 4 pads are placed on the pinch welds, it does 0 damage. Once you get the wheels off, you'll need a 12mm to remove the brake line bolt, flathead needle nose for the ABS sensor, 17mm for the end-link nut, 19mm for the 2 strut bolts, and a 12mm for the 3 top hat nuts. Just take your time so you don't yank the brake line or the ABS wire. Extracting the strut is pretty easy, just like the pull-out method. Here's the factory strut assembly. The red dot is for orientation when reassembling. You're gonna need to get your hands on some spring compressors. I got these from my local auto parts store. It was nice of them to lend me the tools for absolutely free. I also needed a 3/4 wrench and socket to compress the spring. Using an impact would be much faster, but I'm old school and like manual wrenches. You'll need a 6mm Allen key to keep the strut shaft from spinning, and a makeshift tool consisting of locking pliers and a 17mm socket. No pass-through socket set required. Having sharp teeth on the pliers such as these Eagle grips makes a huge difference biting down on a socket. The teeth on these Knipex or Lang locking pliers didn't cut it, as the socket just kept spinning. Compressing the spring to the full extent of the tool was the only way I was able to separate it from the damper. It takes a while with wrenches, but you get there eventually.
This is a fully compressed coil spring using the spring compressors. There is a lot of energy stored, but if you take your time and use common sense, you'll be completely fine. The only way you're going to hurt yourself is if you misuse the tool and you're a complete idiot. If something does happen, make sure to point the north and south poles away from your face and your manhood, and you should be good.
The 17mm nut in the top hat is removed by countering the strut shaft with a 6mm Allen key. I don't ever recommend clamping the strut rod with a vice grip, as that's just dumb. Here's all the components once the strut's apart. You have the 17mm nut, the upper spring seat, the top hat, the dust boot, the coil spring, and the shock absorber itself. The stock GR86 damper is actually very good and made by Showa in Japan, who interestingly also makes the shocks for the CR. Here's an up close shot of the damper and the foam bump stop. Since you're lowering the car, you have to remove 8mm off the upper portion of the foam. You could use a razor blade and just chop the top off, but here in the shop, we like to live a bit more dangerously. Using an industrial belt sander makes quick work of the foam. Remember kids, always wear your safety goggles. The final shape of the bump stop should look something like this. Now it's time to assemble everything back together. It's just a matter of reversing all your steps. As for the spring compressors, they work best by being bolted directly across from each other. The front spring is installed with a grounded flat side facing up. You then sandwich it between the lower and upper spring seat. When all the threads of the strut rod protrude, you know you did it correctly. Next, throw on the top hat and bolt it down with a 17mm nut. Then torque the assembly to 41 foot-pounds. The nut should be seated all the way down and the red dot should be toward the front and outside of the car. Finally, remove the spring compressors. Here's the front strut with a grow coil spring. Looks great and is ready to be installed. The nice thing about lowering springs is if the shock goes out, you can easily get new ones from people who throw them away when they install coilovers. If you got camera bolts, now will be the opportune time to put them in. I start by hanging the strut with the top hat nuts. I then take the bottom 19mm crash bolt and put it into the top hole, while the camber bolt goes into the bottom hole. This allows for a little bit more negative camber. You then reinstall the end link, clip the ABS sensor wire back in place. 114 for the top crash and 97 foot-pounds for the bottom camber bolt. 44 and 20 foot-pounds for the end link and brake line bolts. The top hat nuts get torqued to 17 foot-pounds. Here's a GR86 damper with a grow lowering spring installed. Absolutely stunning. Rinse and repeat on the other side. The silver provides a real nice contrast to the black shock. In the trunk, there's two clips that you need to pop to be able to fold the liner back. This allows access to the two 14mm nuts for the rear shock. When you remove the two 17mm bolts for the lower control arm and the bottom of the shock, as well as the 14mm for the end link, the rear damper just pops right out. Just like delivering a baby. This assembly is pretty much the same as the fronts. The red mark should point towards the back of the car. The only tools you'll need differently for the rears is a 5mm Allen key and a 14mm socket. Here's everything field stripped and the only difference is the shape of the bump stop. You have to cut off the top 22mm, which is at this first groove. And the result should look something like this. Mount the bump stop onto the strut rod and reassemble the shock. The rears are much easier as you don't need to compress the coil spring. Reassembly is simply reversing all previous steps. You may have to leverage the lower control arm, but this is where a 2-post lift comes in handy. I like to start all the nuts and bolts by hand so I don't screw up the threads. Doing so minimizes cross-threading from occurring. The upper shock nuts are 22, two 17mm bolts are 59, and the end link is 28 foot-pounds. Here's the rear shock installed with a grow lowering spring. Hopefully they perform as good as they look. For best results, repeat on the opposite side. I did run into a small issue. When mounting the front wheels, I realized I screwed up big time as they didn't spin freely. Shit. It was a relatively easy fix and I addressed that in another video. This, ladies and gentlemen, is our GR86 running on grow lowering springs. This is how it should have looked like when leaving the factory. For the fronts, the unsettled springs were at 25.5 inches or about an inch lower. When I measured the front corner with a laser pointer, it was too low to read. The front wheel arc now has a nice 2-finger gap. The rear only lowered 1/4 of an inch and measured at 26 3/8, and the laser only measured 6 1/4. The springs hadn't settled yet, so I took the car out for a spin to see if there's any changes. The handling felt the same as I didn't feel any understeer or any snap oversteer. As you can see, the car looks much better now that it's lowered. The GR86 looks simply awesome with 2-finger gaps all around. It still needs an alignment, but for now I'm very happy with the results. Huge thanks to Rianna Aki at HAL Springs for making this project as smooth as possible. Since the website was in Japanese, Rianna translated everything and walked me through my purchase. She even completely translated the installation instructions, which was a huge help. At 55,000 yen plus shipping, buying from the manufacturer was the best price I found. I did ask for the spring rates, but for some reason they never got back to me. Although on Best Motoring it was mentioned that it was 3 and 5K for front and rear. The only thing bad about these lowering springs is now I destroyed my front lip. I guess that's why the reason for the 3-finger gap. Oh well, that's it for us. We're Rouse Productions. Catch you guys later.
Here, I'll just play with it. Take a bunch. I see them covering my face. Ooh.